Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first proper episode of The Red Thread with me, Catrice Horsley. In the next 6 episodes, I'm going to be showing you techniques and perhaps giving you some ideas about how we have formed our identities and our beliefs, and how we can go about changing those in order to create positive change in our lives. In some ways, it's basically to do with why we believe what we believe about ourselves. And if that's not a positive belief about ourselves, if it's not a belief that makes us know we are worthy of love, worthy of listening to, worthy of sharing and telling our story, then what we can do to change that. And where do those stories come from in the first place? How have we developed this identity? So I went from being a speech impaired child from a council estate who lived in poverty, who had many challenges during her childhood and into her teenage years, to becoming an international narrative consultant, an international performance storyteller, and the National Storytelling Laureate for Great Britain. And how did that happen? How did I go from an identity where I was told that I was shy, I was withdrawn, I had no confidence, I was one of the rough kids off the council estate, I was from a problem family, I was from a problem area, all of these very potentially negative stories, into this woman who believes I do have a voice worth listening to, I do have a story worth telling, and I do feel 100% that I am worthy of love. How did that happen? For me, it was all to do with stories and exposure to stories, exposure to fairy tales and traditional stories and made up stories as a child, exposure to stories that I read in government documents about my area, the council estate, when I started to work there, and this idea of those stories aren't my truth from that area, to cultural stories that I became aware of when I moved to Ghana and lived in Ghana for 6 years, and this idea of how the story of beauty and the story of status and the story of skills, good skills to have, were different in different countries and different cultures. So my difference and my journey was all to do with the knowledge of the stories that formed me and that tried to form me, in fact. So that's what I want to explore with you today, the warp and weft of our identities and of the stories that form us. Now, before I start, I have to tell you, I've got the dog next to me, and he does harumph quite a lot and moans. He's the most articulate dog that I've ever come across. So if you hear any harumphing or from underneath the table, it is definitely not me or any other human who is in the household with me. It's just the dog. So, the first image I want to share with you gives you an idea of the warp and weft of our identities. So, from when we're born, we are told stories about ourselves. Our parents or our main carers will give us feedback on who we are and how we are and what we are. You're a good boy, you're a bad boy, you're noisy, you're a very good girl, you're so negative, etc., etc. And these main stories from our parents and carers form the main warp and weft of our identities. So here's an image to represent that. They are the kind of underlying foundation threads that everything else is woven upon. And some of these will come from our teachers as well. You know, we are, during those very formative years, constantly exposed to education and to teachers telling us stuff about us and what we can do and what we can't do and what our behavior is like. So they are the main warp and weft of our identities. And we are not really aware of them being there but they are fundamental to what we believe about ourselves. Then we have cultural narratives, which I would say are also a fundamental, foundational part of our identities. And these weave in as well as a warp and weft, and they are to do with what beauty is, what status is, what are positive skills to have, what are negative skills to have, what being accomplished is, what being educated means. And I want you to think of that in different cultures and different groups. If I'm with a or part of a non-literate group of people who are hunter-gatherers, then I don't know, being able to fix metal pipes isn't going to give me a high status, but being able to hunt will give me a high status. Being very thin might not give me a high status, but actually being a little bit fatter to show that I am a good enough hunter to find lots of food, and that makes me fatter, that's a sign of status. So all of these, again, are quite subliminal, but they are foundational to our identities and what we believe is a positive and what we believe is a negative. So they are the foundation, warp and weft, that come from family, teachers, and the cultures that we are brought up in. And then on top of those, we have loads and loads of different experiences. We can have relationships, we can have bereavements, we can travel, we can get jobs, we can lose jobs, we can have children, and all of these events happen and are woven into our lives, woven into our identities, but they are woven on top of those foundational narratives, those foundational threads, to the point where they almost cover them up. We almost cease to be aware of those that are actually holding everything together. And what happens is, if there is something to do, say, with a relationship, you enter a relationship, and one of your foundational threads that came from a parent was to do with the fact that you are stupid and you are not worthy of love. Who could love you? Who could love you? Look at you. You might have heard that from a parent, and it's there underneath. And then you lay a relationship on top of it. And something might happen in that relationship. Your partner might go, "Oh God, you're so stupid sometimes," or "That was a stupid thing to do." And that foundational thread is snagged, it pulls, and it echoes through the relationship. And you believe that you are unworthy of love. It shows through underneath. So as we go through these life experiences, and we make sense of them, we narrate them, we story them, many of those are storied through and made sense of through those foundational stories, those foundational threads. And there are snags and pulls happening the whole time. I have an issue with control. I don't like anybody trying to control me or tell me you shouldn't be doing that, or you're not allowed to do that. I mean, within reason, obviously. So I will often interpret something that is given to me in terms of care as something that's to do with somebody trying to control me because they believe that I'm not capable or I'm stupid. So as an example, if my husband's helping me get into the boat, he might say, "Oh, be careful, don't slip, watch where you put your foot." And I'm serious. I'm like, what the hell? Do you think I've got to the age of 57? I can't get in a boat. What the hell? And suddenly that snag has affected and pulled at a core warp and weft story that I carry from the childhood that I grew up in and certain things that were said to me. and following relationships that I had. So it is really vital that we become aware of those, because in fact, our red thread of identity, and I'll keep on coming back to this idea, the red thread of our identity is the main thread that we use, our story that we use to make sense of everything else. We look at it through that red thread. So all of those experiences are woven together on top of those foundational narratives, and they create our red thread of identity. We weave our relationships into them. We weave the people that we've lost, mourning, grief, children, new jobs, our friendships. All of those are woven into a story, a red thread of self-belief and of self-narrative. And we're not even aware of it. We are not aware of why we believe what we believe about ourselves. We will just think it's because I'm stupid. And it's probably not because you're stupid. It's because you believe a story that was told to you when you were 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 by a teacher or by a significant person in your life who said you were stupid at that point, and you wove it in. It was woven into you and you didn't even know it. So what I want to start to do is I want to start to deconstruct our stories, to unweave ourselves, to untangle ourselves, and to start to spin the red thread that we want in our lives, the story that we want in our lives. And we can't do it in amongst all of the others. We have to somehow separate it and untangle it. It's interesting, I think, because when we go back in time to our early years, our parents, our mothers will have mothered us based on a story that they were told. And there is this, and they would have got that story from their mothers, and they would have got that story from their mothers, or specialists or experts in books. And this idea of parenting and what we give our children and what our children need changes generationally, but there was always a core element to it. And I've been reading a huge amount about the generational impact of trauma on children and therefore on adults, and how it impacts on an epigenetic level. And I've talked about that in the previous episodes. And I just want to mention one thing here that is to do with that. And that is this idea that if our babies are crying, we ignore them. Many of us have been told our children need to develop a routine and we should just leave them crying. A baby cries to have contact with you because a baby can't self-regulate yet. It has to co-regulate with its carer or its parent. And when you hold the baby, you are both co-regulating. And self-regulation in a child, where they can control their emotions, be aware of their emotions, comes from co-regulation in their early years. You can't have self-regulation without the co-regulation first. And I know that many moms would just leave their babies crying because that's what the experts said. And so there would have been a story already starting to be formed in the warp and weft of those babies' minds that would link into the fact that they're not being held or loved or given what they need when they needed it. And that does impact on our brains and the way they're wired. And even if you look at it from a genetic level, you know, in the caveman days, if a baby was crying, the mother wouldn't go and put the baby in the cave next door and leave it there unattended because some goddamn saber-toothed tiger would have eaten it and taken it away. we would have not been able to survive as a human species, for goodness sake. So we would have slept with our children, and we would have fed our children when they needed to be fed, because that's what enabled us to survive as a human species. So many of us will be carrying certain stories on quite a subliminal level, not because people were consciously trying to negate us, but people were trying to do the best that they could do based on what they knew at that time. So this is not about judgment of others. This is about ownership of self. It is not about judgment of others. It is about ownership of self. So at the end of each of these episodes, I'm going to give you an exercise that you can do if you want. I'm going to invite you to take part. And the first exercise for this, identifying the warp and weft of our identities, is based on the exercise that I've just shown you, the images that I've just shown you. And it's to draw a gingerbread person, like I did. And inside that gingerbread person, write all the stuff that you believe about yourself. You know, I'm not very good at maths. I'm an introvert. I don't like being around people. I'm not very good in social situations, or I'm very confident. I'm very outgoing. I'm athletic. I'm positive, etc. So it can be positives, negatives, anything that you intrinsically believe about yourself. And then around the outside, and that's from that you would have got from your parents or your carers or your teachers, yeah. And then around the outside, I want you to identify stuff that you believe about yourself based on what your culture tells you. So what does success look like? What does beauty look like? What does smart look like? You know, I always think we talk about alternative education, we talk about alternative medicine, and I always think alternative to what? Because there is this huge assumption that Western medicine, Western education, that is the basis for truth of what it should look like, and everything else is compared to. Even when we talk about inclusion, inclusion into what? And if we talk about diversity, diverse to what? So from our cultures, we get a huge amount of stories that will shape the outlines of our identities. So the personal stories, the stories from teachers, parents, carers, kind of create that internal structure of narrative, and then the cultural stories shape the external in a way and give us an outline of what it is to be. So that's your homework. Just to start to unpick where the stories came from that you believe about yourself. Again, if anybody wants to, please put a thread. It doesn't have to be a red thread. I particularly like red, and there's mythology attached to it. It can be a blue thread or a green thread or a yellow thread, whatever thread you want, around your wrist or somewhere else, to help remind you of what that story is that you want to create and spin from all of those incredible stories that are within you. We can pick and choose. We can weave and spin the identities that we want by choosing and picking the stories that exist within us, but doing so consciously, knowing where those stories came from. So we have to deconstruct and separate all the threads before we can start to choose the ones that we can weave together into our red thread of identity. Please subscribe to the channel. And also I would love for you to drop some comments below on how you found the exercise. This is not a therapy session. This is almost like coaching ideas to start to help you identify the different threads that create the story you believe about yourself. So no disclosures, but it was an interesting exercise. I hadn't realized, or I didn't find it that helpful. Whatever you want to say about the exercise, please drop it in the comments below. And have a look at the website, www.narrativeforchange.com, where the blog is up all about finding our red thread. So take care for now. And the next exercise that I'm going to share in the next episode is going to be about what areas in our lives do these internal narratives show up, and how do they start to impact in those external lives, and by becoming aware of them, how we can create positive change in those external lives that we have. So I hope that will be useful, and yes, please subscribe to the channel. Take care for now. Bye bye.